Good morning, everyone. Hello, am I audible?
Good morning, Doctor.
Okay, morning. Thank you. Okay, before starting, is there any question about the previous lecture or assignments? I think I gave you submission link for the second assignment. And in the 6th of January, as we agreed last week, you have to provide one more, what is it? E-flyer, yeah. What we call it, to summarize the second assignment, becoming one flyer, or and you submit it on 6th of January. Okay. This is the attendance and the password. You can scan it or use this password. Okay, done, yeah? Then we continue our lecture. I think we stop in slide number 14. So we continue to slide number 15, I think. Okay, this is still in marginalist economic thought. As we discussed before, we already discussed about why the output becoming diminishing. Not only output, I think, also the utilities for the consumption theory. Yeah? Okay. So when we talk about the departure here, about the marginalist economic thought, I think we have to start from the classical economists first here. Yeah, actually, the central question was not primarily how an individual consumer chooses between goods, but how the entire economy can function continuously when production is organized through the division of labor. So because of the economy depends on specialization and exchange, classical analysis focus on the condition that sustain production over the time and on the social mechanism that determine distribution and accumulation. Actually, in practice, this means that the classical agenda centered on three linked topics: production, and then distribution, and accumulation. Production, how output is created; distribution, how output is shared among wages, profits, and rents; and accumulation, how saving and investment expand the productive capacity of the economy. A key purpose of economic analysis in this tradition was to explain how changes in the quantity and quality of the labor force affect the rate of growth of aggregate output. Population growth, labor supply, and worker productivity were not side issues. So they were fundamental drivers of long-run economic performance. In classical thinkers were especially concerned with whether rising population would press against limited resources, and whether technological progress could offset diminishing return. And in classical thinking, the rate of growth is closely connected to the rate of profit. Uh, Profit itself provide both the incentive and the means of capitalists to invest and expand production. So therefore, anything that systematically changes profit, such as rising wages, increasing rents, or declining productivity, can influence the pace of capital accumulation and in turn economic growth. So this is why classical economists paid great attention to secular trends in factors, prices, and distributive shares. Who receive how much of national income is not only a question of fairness. So it determines saving, investment, and economy's long-run trajectory. So unlike the classical economies, which is who centered their analysis on production, distribution, and long-run accumulation. So the marginalists define economics mainly as the study of how scarce resources are used optimally to satisfy human needs. So the focus shifts from the dynamic of growth and class distribution to the logic of allocation here. So how to assign limited inputs across competing use so that welfare, usually expressed as utility, is maximized. In this framework, the supply of input is typically treated as a given, or what we call it in, usually we use it, this term in econometrics is exogenous, yeah. So population, the stock of capital, available land, and existing technology are often taken as constraint rather than variable to be explained within the theory. So given these constraints, the key questions become how should labor and other resources be employed so that utility of the resulting output is as high as possible. Okay. This approach is closely connected to marginal analysis. Marginal analysis evaluates choices by comparing small changes, such as producing one more unit of good, using one more hour of labor, or consuming one additional unit to decide whether a decision should continue or stop. So this is the what is it? The definition of marginal analysis evaluation. Yeah. So if the extra benefit, or in consumption theory, we call it marginal utility, exceeds the extra cost, marginal sacrifice, expanding the activity makes sense. So if not, it should be reduced. So this reasoning creates a clear method for explaining demand, supply decisions, and equilibrium as well. From here, we can see that the marginalist attitude toward the Malthusian theory of population, for instance, since population is treated as a given constraint in many marginalist models, so Malthusian population dynamics become less central to the core theory. So instead of viewing population growth as the main long-run driver of wages and profits, marginalists here concentrate on efficient allocation under scarcity at the point in time. Actually, here scarcity is crucial in this definition. A thing may be useful, but it becomes an economic good only when it is limited relative to wants. Economics for the marginalists begin exactly at that point where resources are scarce and choices must be made. For classical economists, value was treated mainly as objective. So the underlying intuition was that in the long run, the normal or natural price of a good is connected to the difficulty of production. So in other words here, goods tend to exchange at ratios that reflect how much labor and then capital and other resources must be used to produce them, given prevailing techniques. So if a commodity is costly to produce because it requires more labor time, more expensive inputs, or production under less favorable conditions, then its value is expected to be higher. This is like supply and demand law, yeah. So this objective approach supported classical discussion about distribution. If production costs determine value, then understanding wages, profit, and rent become central to explaining price and growth. On the other hand, the marginalists shifted the explanation toward a subjective theory of value. So they argued that value does not arise only from the production side. It depends critically on how consumers evaluate the usefulness of commodities. Utility refers to the satisfaction a person expects from consuming a good. Because individuals have different preferences and face different circumstances, valuation is not the same for everyone. So the marginalists emphasize that what matters for exchange is not total usefulness, but marginal utility. The additional satisfaction from one or more unit here. So since marginal utility usually diminish as consumption increases, the willingness to pay for the next unit tends to fall. Hello? Excuse me. Who is it? Okay. Okay. So from this, the subjective view does not mean that costs are irrelevant. Marginalists usually combine demand-side utility with supply-side scarcity and cost conditions. So prices emerge from the interaction of demand based on marginal utility and preferences and supply based on scarcity and production constraints. So however, the direction from this, we can see that rather than treating cost as the primary source of value, marginalists rated consumer valuation as the key element that gives goods economic value in the first place. You can see here the example of value of a pizza, yeah? The classical thought because of they think that the value from the objective side. So based on the difficulty of production, so they measure labor costs, flour, yeast, tomatoes, cheese, olives, and etc. But the marginalists measure utilities the pizza gave to the consumer. Okay, so now we will see how classical and marginalist economists interpret the role of prices and why equilibrium becomes central in the marginalist framework. In classical economics, price, especially in the long run, natural price, were mainly understood as indicator of the relative difficulty of production. So if one good requires more labor, more capital advance, or faces higher costs because production conditions are less favorable, its normal price will tend to be higher. So in this sense, prices communicate information about production conditions and underlying costs, and they help explain how output is distributed across wages, profits, and rent. While marginalists reinterpreted prices in a different way. So for marginalists, prices primarily indicate scarcity relative to consumers' preferences. Scarcity matters because resources and goods are limited, while wants are many. Preferences matter because demand reflects how individuals rank different goods and how much satisfaction they expect from additional units. So a price in here, therefore, signals how strongly society values the marginal unit of a good compared with the marginal unit of other goods given limited resources. So from here, when a good become scarcer, or when consumers desire it more strongly, its price tend to rise. So when it becomes more abundant relative to wants, its price tend to fall. So prices in this view are not just about cost; they are the outcome of interaction between demand, preferences, and marginal utility, and supply, constraint, technology, and scarcity. So because of the marginalist approach treats the economy as a problem of allocation, the notion of equilibrium becomes essential here. So equilibrium is the situation in which plans are mutually consistent, such as consumers maximize utility subject to their budgets, firms maximize profit subject to cost and technology, and markets clear so that quantities demanded equal quantities supplied. So at equilibrium point, marginal conditions hold, such as marginal utility per unit of currency being equalized across goods for consumers, and marginal cost equaling price for firms. So these marginal equalities show that resources are being used where they generate the greatest additional value given constraints. So this is why equilibrium has a central role in marginalist economies, because it provides a benchmark for the optimal utilization of scarce resources. Price coordinate decentralized decision by guiding consumers and producers toward choices that collectively balance scarcity and preferences. In here, actually, classical theory sees prices as reflections of production difficulties, while marginalism sees prices as scarcity signals that help achieve an efficient allocation through equilibrium. So for marginalists, income distribution is essential as a special application of price theory. So wages, interest, rent, and profits are treated as prices of factor productions. So the price of labor, the price of capital services, and the price of land or natural resources. So distribution is therefore explained using the same tools used to explain commodity prices, which is supply and demand, marginal condition, and equilibrium. In competitive markets, each factor is paid according to its marginal contribution, often expressed through marginal productivity. Okay? For example, wages are linked to the marginal product of labor, and the return to capital is linked to the marginal product of capital, but sometimes linked to the time preferences. In this framework, distribution is not a separate social problem. It is a market outcome generated by individual decisions and constraints. While in classical economies, treated distribution very differently here. So for them, income distribution was a problem with autonomous characteristics, meaning that it could not be reduced to ordinary price theory. Distribution was tied to the structure of society and the relationships between major social classes, workers, capitalists, and landlords. Wages, profits, and rent were not simply prices determined by marginal adjustment, but reflected deeper forces such as bargaining power, institutional arrangements, property rights, and long-run dynamics like population growth, technological change, and the availability of land. So actually in here, classical analysis asks questions such as what determines the general level of wages, why do profit tends to rise or fall over time, how does rent emerge as cultivation extend to less fertile land. So these were seen as central to understanding the economy's evolution and its political tensions. So this is why power relation matter in classical view. Distribution is shaped by who controls key assets such as land, capital, or labor power, and by how these groups interact in markets and politics. So the classical approach often implies that distributive conflict is built into the system, and that changes in distribution influence growth through saving and investment behavior. We can see that from here, marginalist internalized distribution into general price theory, such as factor incomes are prices determined by marginal condition and equilibrium, while classical economists separate distribution as a foundational issue connected to class structure, social conflict, and long-run economic development. So what about value and distribution here? The classical approach to value and distribution in here explain the rewards to the three main factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Of course, using three distinct theories. Production creates a social surplus. How that surplus is divided into rent, wages, and profits. Actually, in classical economics, these categories are not merely accounting labels. They reflect different economic roles and different social groups. First, here is land rent. Land rent itself is explained as a differential surplus over the marginal cost of cultivation. Because land differs in fertility and location, output from the same amount of labor and capital can vary across plots. So the marginal land is the least productive land still in use. It just covers the cost of cultivation and earns no rent. So better land yield more output than marginal land. So the excess is captured as rent by the landlord. So rent in this view is not a necessary cost of production for society as a whole. It arises because of scarcity and differences in land quality. The second is labor wages. Explaining by the long run cost of producing the means of subsistence. In classical economies, often argued that competition among workers and population dynamics push wages toward a subsistence level in the long run, meaning a level sufficient to maintain workers and allow the labor force to reproduce over time. So while actual wages can fluctuate, the underlying anchor is that cost of living and the social standard of subsistence in a particular society. So this view links wages to demographic forces and to the broader condition of labor supply. And the third is the rate of profit on capital. In here, rate of profit on capital treated as residual. After paying wages as a necessary cost to sustain labor and accounting for rent as differential surplus to landowners, what remains from the product is profit accruing to capitalists. So profits are therefore closely tied to the size of the surplus and to the technical and social condition that affect wages and productivity. So because capital accumulation depends on profit, classical economists made profit central to growth and long-run dynamics. From here, we can see that the classical approach explains distribution with separate factor-specific mechanism. So rent is determined by land differences and scarcity, wages by subsistence cost and labor supply, profits by what is left over. So this framework also implies that changes in one component, such as rising rent due to diminishing return, can squeeze profit and slow accumulation, linking distribution directly to the path of economic development. So, on the other hand, from the marginalist perspective or approach to factor rewards and how it differs from the classical separate theories method, marginalists argued that a factor of production, such as labor, land, and capital we discussed before, receive income because they are scarce relative to consumers' want for the goods and services those factors help produce. So scarcity matters because if a factor were abundant and easily available, its price would be low. If it is limited, while the products it can produce are strongly desired, its price will be higher. So in this sense, factor incomes are not treated as fixed by social class rules or subsistence alone, but as market outcomes connected to consumer preferences and production constraints. the key idea from this that the income of productive factor is derived from prices in the product market. So the value of factor depends on the value of what it can produce. There is an example here. So for instance, so the wage of labor involved in producing chocolate depends on the demand for chocolate. So if a consumer strongly want chocolate, and if chocolate provides high marginal utility, the product can command a higher price in the market. So when the selling price is higher, firms can afford to pay more to hire the necessary labor and other inputs because those inputs have generate higher revenue. Conversely, if demand for chocolate falls, the product price declines, revenue falls, and firms reduce their willingness to pay for labor in that industry. So in this way, wages and other factor rewards are linked to consumers' valuation of final goods. So this reasoning is often formalized in the concept of derived demand. If you remember in microeconomics theory, yeah. So which is a demand for inputs is derived from demand for outputs. So firms hire labor and rent capital because this input help them produce goods that consumer will buy. In competitive equilibrium, factor prices tend to reflect marginal contribution, which is how much extra revenue an additional unit of labor or capital can generate. So this is the talk from marginalis, yeah. Okay. Any question until this slide? So no, yeah. So we continue. Actually, there is a fundamental debate in value theory between classical and marginalis. Marginalis itself sometimes it is called neoclassic, but still new to name it neoclassic. One scholar said that marginalis include in neoclassical economic thought, but other scholars said that marginalis is in between classical and neoclassical. So the debate is where does value come from and what determines the value of productive resources. One way to frame the classical position is that value is closely connected to production conditions because final goods require labor, capital, and land. Classical economists tended to explain long-run prices by reference to cost of production and the technical difficulty of producing goods. So from that, the factors of production help create value in final goods and market prices over time reflect those underlying production costs. Marginalis refers the direction of explanation. So they didn't deny the factor of production are valuable. Instead, they argued that the extent of factors value is determined by the value of the final products it helps produce. And the value of those final products is grounded in marginal utility and consumer preferences. So in other words, the market does not value labor, land, or capital in isolation. These factors are valued because they contribute to producing goods that people want. And the strength of that want is measured at the margin. So this is why marginalists said that factor of production do not confer value on final goods. A factor can be technically essential, but it will not be highly valued if it produces something that consumers do not care much about. So, for example, here, skilled labor used to produce a product with weak demand will not command high wages, even if the production process is difficult. So, by contrast, labor used in producing a highly demanded product may be paid more because the final good sells at a higher prices. So the same reasoning applies to land and capital as well. The return depend on what consumers are willing to pay for outputs, not merely on their physical contribution. Okay. So from this, the marginalist stand is a top-down valuation, which means that consumers' preference determine product values and product values determine factor values. So this was a major shift from classical cost-based explanation and became a cornerstone of neoclassical microeconomics. Another debate is classical value theory was inadequate because it lacked generality. Classical economists usually explain long-run value by the difficulty of or cost of production, such as how much labor and other inputs were required to produce a good under normal conditions. So this approach worked reasonably well for reproducible commodities, especially manufactured goods, where supplies can expand if prices rise and where costs provide an anchor for normal prices. However, so the problem is that not all goods fit this pattern. So some goods cannot be produced again or cannot be reproduced in larger quantities, no matter how high the price becomes. For these cases, a cost of production explanation is incomplete or even irrelevant. So the classical framework struggled particularly with goods whose supply is fixed. If the quantity of a good is essentially given, then price cannot be explained by production cost in the usual way, because production is not the margin that adjusts. Instead, price is driven mainly by demand, how strongly people want the good relative to its limited availability. So this forces the classical approach to introduce separate explanations, which reduces the elegance and generality of the theory. Land is common example here. While improvements to land can be produced, the total amount of land in a given location is fixed. So this is the easiest example, yeah, when we talk about the lack of generality here. The total amount of land in a given location when doing a production is, of course, fixed, and the desirability of that location can change greatly. So the price of prime land in a city center is not determined by the cost of producing the land, because the land was not produced in the first place. Its price depends on scarcity and on the intensity of competing demands for that location. Another example is rare paintings provide an even clearer, a unique artwork by a famous artist cannot be reproduced. And its market value can rise dramatically even though its historical production cost may have been low. So the price is shaped by collectors' preferences, prestige, and willingness to pay, not by the cost of materials of the labor time originally used. In this case, cost of production theory cannot explain why the price is high, why it changes, or why similar physical objects can have vastly different market values. So this criticism does not mean classical economists ignore demand. So rather, it highlights that their main theoretical anchor for value production difficulty could not easily handle scarcity goods without adding special cases. The marginalist approach claimed to solve this weakness by using a more general principle, which is value depends on marginal utility and scarcity, which can explain both reproducible goods and fixed supply goods within the same framework. So, a key criticism of classical cost of production reasoning is that it can seem to suggest that price come from the past. If value is anchored mainly in the cost already incurred, labor use, capital advance, and the technical difficulty of production, then it appears that historical sacrifices determine present prices. This is, we call it as problematic, so because it does not fit well with market realities. In practice, firms can spend a great deal to produce something and still fail to obtain a high price or even any price at level. So from here, marginalists argue that a large cost incurred does not necessarily result in high price. The reasoning is simple here. Value depends on utility and consumption, meaning that it depends on whether consumers actually want the good and how strongly they desire additional units. In this sense, value does not come from the past, which is the sunk cost of production, but from the future, anticipated satisfaction from consumption and the willingness to pay in the market. If consumer do not value the product, the market will not reward the producer, regardless of how much effort or expense went into making it. So this leads to an important implication is no matter what costs are incurred, price depends on utility relative to scarcity. So costs can influence supply decisions going forward. Firms will not continue producing as at a loss in the long run, but costs already incurred cannot force consumers to pay more. So what matters is marginal valuation, the benefit buyers expect from acquiring the good compared with other alternatives. Dead stock refers to goods that have been produced but cannot be sold at a price that covers their cost or sometimes cannot be sold at all. So the existence of that stock shows that production effort alone does not guarantee value. A warehouse full unwanted goods may represent substantial past costs, but their market value can still be low because demand is weak. From the marginalist viewpoint, those sunk costs are irrelevant to current pricing, which is the market price reflects what buyers are willing to pay now based on expected utility. So, why earlier value theories were often confused? They failed to distinguish clearly between total utility and marginal utility. Total utility refers to the overall satisfaction a person receive from consuming all units of a good, because some goods are essential for life, such as water. Their total utility can be extremely high. So marginal utility, in contrast, refers to the extra satisfaction gained from consuming one additional unit. Prices, marginalists argue that determined mainly by marginal utility, not by total of average utility. So this distinction matters because people make choices at the margin. A consumer usually decides whether to buy one more unit, not whether the good is useful in general. As consumption increases, the urgency of additional units typically falls. So the first unit of water are used for drinking and basic survival, so they generate very high marginal utility. But once those urgent needs are met, extra unit may be used for less important purposes, such as washing a car, watering a lawn, or other non-essential uses. So the marginal utility of additional water becomes low. In normal circumstances, water is also abundant in many places, so the marginal utility is plentiful and not highly valued in exchange. We can see here from the example of diamond water paradox. The paradox asks why is water, which is essential and therefore has high usefulness, often cheap, while diamond, which are not essential, are expensive. So from here, the marginalist answer is that the market price reflects marginal conditions. Water's total utility is high, but its marginal utility is often low because it is relatively abundant and consumers already have enough for their most urgent uses. While diamonds, on the other hand, have lower total utility in the sense that life does not depend on them, but their marginal utility can be high for buyers who desire them for status, beauty, or investment, especially because diamonds are scarce as well. When a good is scarce, the marginal utility is harder to obtain, and the marginal utility is acquiring one more unit can remain high. So therefore, in price determination is not the overall usefulness of good, but the value placed on the last unit exchange under condition of scarcity. So marginalists show that once we focus on marginal utility, the paradox disappears. Prices can be low for goods with high total usefulness and high for goods with low essential usefulness, because market respond to relative scarcity and marginal valuations, not to the total benefit. Okay, this is one of economists from marginalists. The first is Karl Menger. Menger was an Austrian economist best known as a founder of marginalist revolution and the leading figure behind what later became the Austrian school. He was born in Galicia in 1840, region then within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And his early environment exposed him to a diverse social and political setting. So this background, his history, matter because Menger became deeply interested in how economic life develops through institutions, rules, and everyday choices, not only through abstract models. So Menger pursued higher education at University of Vienna and Praha, where he gained a strong foundation in law, administration, and the social sciences. So he later received his doctorate at the University of Krakow. This combination of his knowledge, actually, this combination of training, helped shape his style of economics. So he was highly analytical, but also attentive to history, legal arrangements, and the way real societies organize a change. Before becoming fully established as an academic, Menger also worked in journalism and government-related circles, experiences that sharpened his awareness of practical economic issues and the limits of purely theoretical. These publications appeared in 1871, the same year as William Stanley Jeffons' major book, Making, in 1871 as well, which is a symbolic date for the emergence of marginal utility theory. So remember that 1871 is a symbol for marginal utility theory. Yeah? So in principle, Menger argued that values is based on subjective evaluation and that prices are linked to marginal utility. A view that challenged older classical explanation rooted mainly in production costs, as we discussed before. So Menger's long-range intellectual goal went beyond writing one influential book. He aimed to produce a systematic body of economic theory, and even more broadly from that one. So a comprehensive treatise on a character and methods of the social sciences in general. So his ambition later influences methodological debates, especially his emphasis on careful conceptual reasoning and the development of economic laws grounded in individual choice and the formation of institutions over the time. So Karl Menger's contribution to marginalized economics is how goods become economic goods through human valuation. So Menger argued that value is not a fixed property that sits inside an object like weight or color. Instead, values arise from a relationship. People have needs. They recognize certain objects as able to satisfy those needs, and they face scarcity. So this perspective strengthens the marginalist shift toward subjective value and help build a systematic foundation for later macroeconomics. So Menger's starting point is simple here. For something to matter economically, there must first be a want. Want is any desire or need that an individual seeks to satisfy, such as hunger, shelter, comfort, safety, or even status. If no one wants something, so then there is no reason to devote effort to obtain it, and it will not become part of economic decision making. So, however, the existence of want alone is not enough. So the second condition is that the object of must have one satisfying power. So it must be capable in reality of helping satisfy the want. Food satisfies hunger, clothing provides warmth, and medicine can reduce illness. If an object cannot actually meet a need, then it cannot become an economic good, regardless of how strongly someone might wish otherwise. So the third condition is often overlooked but is crucial in Menger's reasoning. Consumer must be aware of the object's one satisfying power. Knowledge matters here. If people do not know that a plant can be used as medicine, or that a mineral can be a mineral can be refined into useful input, then the object will not be valued and will not be demanded. So this insight anticipates later discussion about information, learning, and discovery in markets. Economic value requires not only needs and physical properties, but also recognizing and understanding. And the fourth, the good must be available, of course. So even if a want exists, an object could satisfy, it cannot function as a good in economic life if it cannot be accessed or used. Availability includes practical accessibility, ownership right, the ability to acquire it through exchange, and the physical possibility of obtaining it. An object that exists in the theory but cannot be reached or controlled does not become part of ordinary economic calculation. And the fifth and decisive condition is that the good must be scarce relative to want. Scarcity is what turns usefulness into an economic problem. If the quantity available is limited compared to the ones that exist, then people must make choices about how to allocate the good. Those choices create opportunity cost and trade-off, and they give rise to valuation and price. In Menger's framework, scarcity is not simply being rare in an absolute sense. It is relative. A good becomes economic when the availability amount is insufficient to satisfy all wants fully. So this is why Menger emphasized that goods are not scarce, may still be extremely useful, but are not economic goods in the strict sense. Air is essential for life and has enormous total usefulness, yet it is usually abundant and freely available. because most people do not face a practical need to ration air, air is normally not priced and is not a central object of market exchange. Only when scarcity appears through pollution, restricted access, or special environments does air become an economic good. For example, oxygen tanks, air filters, or clean air rights. The same logic applies to water as well here. In a region where water is abundant, it may be cheap. In a drought or a desert, it becomes scarce and strongly valued. So by divining economic goods through these conditions, Menger links a scarcity, subjective evaluation, and marginal reasoning in a coherent way. He showed that value begins with human needs and knowledge, and that the economic significance of an object depends on whether scarcity forces people to choose among competing uses. So this insight from him supports the marginalist claim that prices and allocation are driven by valuation at the margin, not simply by historical production effort. Menger also introduced a useful classification of goods by order here, which helps explain how production is linked to human needs. The basic idea is that goods differ according to how directly they satisfy wants. This classification is important because it shows that value can be traced backward from consumption to the inputs that make consumption possible. First order goods are consumption goods. They are capable of satisfying human needs directly because people can use them immediately. Examples include bread, clean water, clothing, medicine, or a finished cigarette maybe, or when a person consumes a first order good, the want is met without needing further transformation. In Menger's framework, this direct link to needs makes first order goods the starting point for understanding value, because consumer evaluation and utility are experienced at the level of final consumption. The second is higher order goods are producer goods, meaning goods used to make other goods. So they derive their goods character from their ability to produce lower order goods. So for instance, floors, ovens, and baking labor are higher order goods because they have produced bread as a first order good. So higher order goods satisfy human needs only indirectly through their contribution to producing consumption goods or to producing something. So this is a key marginalist insight actually. So the value of input is not independent, it is derived from the expected value of the outputs consumers want. Menger also emphasized complementary among higher order goods. So the ability of higher order good to help satisfy needs usually depends on having other complementary goods availability at the same time. So many productive process require a combination of input. So for example, tobacco alone does not directly satisfy the want for smoking unless it is combined with complementary goods such as rolling paper, a filter, machinery for processing, packaging, and distribution services. If one essential complementary input is missing, so the productive value of the other input can fall sharply. An expensive machine is useless without power. Raw material are useless without tools and skilled labor. So this classification clarifies how production is organized in stages and why coordination matters. Consumer ultimately value first order goods, but producing them requires chains of higher order goods working together. So therefore, understanding value and allocation requires analyzing not only consumption, but also the complex structure of complementary inputs that transform resources into goods that meet human needs. So the distinction between economic and non-economic goods in a Menger style marginalist framework can be seen in here. So the key point is that there is nothing inherently economic inside an object. Whether something becomes an economic good depends on the structure of supply and demand specifically, whether the available quantity is sufficient relative to human wants. If requirements, the wants or needs people seek to satisfy are greater than the available supply, then scarcity exists and the good becomes an economic good. If supply is abundant relative to wants, the good may still be useful, but it will not normally be treated as an economic good because it does not require rationing or deliberate allocation. So this distinction connects directly to the concept of value. A good is said to have value when humans perceive that satisfying a particular need depends on having command over the good. So command here means control of access. The person believes that without processing or obtaining the good, the need cannot be met. So value therefore arises from a perceived dependence between needs and the means to satisfy them. If you believe you need clean water to satisfy thirst, and you recognize that access to clean water is limited, then water becomes valuable to you in an economic sense. So this is the simple explanation. Yeah. It is also, there is a value from utility. So utility is the capacity of a commodity to satisfy human needs. Utility can exist as an object potential. For example, food can satisfy hunger, but it matters economically only if it is recognized. Once the utility is recognized, it becomes a prerequisite for goods character, meaning that the object is understood as a good that can serve human purposes. So, however, utility alone does not guarantee economic status. Air has huge utility, but because it is usually abundant, it is often non-economic. If you see that economic goods must be economized. So economizing means that making deliberate choices under scarcity, which deciding how much to use now versus later, or how to allocate among different uses, or whether to trade it. So when goods are scarce, individual and societies must compare alternatives and manage resources carefully. So this requirement to economize is what defines the economic problem itself. So markets, prices, and institutions emerge largely because economizing is necessary. They help coordinate decisions about scarce goods whose recognized utility makes them valuable, but whose limited supply forces trade-off. So there is equi-marginal principle is defined a practical rule about how people choose when their resources are limited. It starts from a simple fact that satisfaction have different degrees of importance. Some wants feel urgent, such as food, rent, basic transport, while others are less urgent, such as snack, entertainment, or nicer brand. Because income, time, and goods are scarce, an individual cannot fully satisfy every want. So the person must allocate spending across different goods in a way that gives the greatest total satisfaction. Here, there's a step-by-step logic to explain the equi-marginal principle here. So the first is the individual asks, if I spend a little more on this good, how much extra satisfaction do I gain? So that extra satisfaction is marginal utility, which is the benefit from one more unit or from a small extra amount. Second, the person compares marginal utilities across goods. If one more unit of good A gives more extra satisfaction than one more unit of good B, it is sensible to shift spending toward A. Okay? And the third, as the person buys more of A, its marginal utilities tend to fall because additional units satisfy less urgent uses. Meanwhile, if the person buys less of B, the marginal utility of B tends to rise because the remaining units are used for more important purposes. So this continues until there is no easy improvement left. So at the point of best allocation, the last unit of satisfaction gained from each good at the margin is equalized, given the budget and prices, of course. So economists often express this an equal marginal utility per unit of money, meaning the person tries to get the same extra satisfaction from the last dollar or the last ringgit spent on each good. If the last 10 ringgit spent on food gives more satisfaction than the last 10 ringgit spent on entertainment, the person should move some spending from entertainment to food. So if the opposite is true, the person should shift the other way. So equilibrium is reached when moving money no longer increases total satisfaction. So this principle also explain why people do not necessarily satisfy urgent wants completely before buying anything else. So people do satisfy urgent needs first, but they often stop short of perfect satisfaction and still spend something on less urgent wants. So for example, just took it from the book, a student might not buy the healthiest possible diet or the most comfortable housing, but still buys a basic phone plan or an occasional trade. So why? Because after a certain point, the extra satisfaction from improving food or housing further may be small, while the extra satisfaction from adding a bit of communication or leisure may be relatively larger. So the person balances more complete satisfaction of pressing wants with partial satisfaction of less pressing wants. So how we link equal-marginal principle to the definition of value? So the value of a good is defined by the want satisfaction that would be lost in the last unit of the good were not available. So this last unit usually serves the least urgent use that the person still chooses to satisfy with the current stock. So the goods value is tied to the least important satisfaction that depends on it. If the last unit is used for a low priority purpose, losing it would not hurt much. So the goods marginal value is low. But if the last unit is needed for a high priority purpose, losing it would cause a large loss of satisfaction. So the marginal value is high here. So this is why marginal utility becomes central to value in marginalist economics. Any questions? Easy, yeah, to understand about the marginal utility because it is happen in our daily activity. Okay. So from okay. So even when economists do not provide a detailed analysis of cost, they can still explain the valuation of higher order goods. That is production goods of or a factor of production. The key idea is that inputs are not valued primarily because of their past production costs. Instead, they are valued because of what they can help produce for consumers in the future. So a central concept here is the complementary, as explained before, of production goods. So most inputs are not useful by themselves. They only become productive when combined with other necessary input. Iron, for example, cannot satisfy a human need directly. But when iron is combined with tools, skilled labor, machinery, and design, it can become a consumer good that does satisfy a want. Because production is coordinated process, the value of one input depends on whether the complementary inputs are available and how effectively they work together. So from this perspective, production goods derive their value from the value of final consumption goods. This is an extension of the marginal utility principle into the whole area of production and distribution. So the marginal utility of an input is linked to the marginal utility of the final product that the input helps create. The marginal utility of a piece of iron can be understood through the marginal utility of the final product made from that iron, such as timber. So if consumer value timbers highly, timbers can sell at higher prices, and firm will be willing to pay more for the iron needed to produce them. Okay, this logic also explains why input valuation is fundamentally forward-looking. So the present value of the means of production equals the prospective value of the consumer goods they will produce, but with deductions. Those deductions reflect the margins required for interest and profit. In simple terms here, expected revenue from selling the final goods is not fully available to pay for materials and input. So part must remain as profit for the entrepreneur and as interest for the provider of capital and time. So this is why there is an equation here: materials value equal revenue minus margin of interest and minus profit. Higher order goods are priced as claims on future consumer value, discounted by the necessary return to capital and enterprises. So this ties production, distribution, and valuation into one marginalist framework. So this is one example to think about how marginalist economics value productive factors such as labor, capital, and land. So just imagine a simple production process where a given amount of labor A, capital B, and land C are combined to produce an output X. So in marginalist reasoning, the value of each input is connected to its marginal contribution to output, and ultimately the utility that consumers receive from the final goods. So to see the value of a unit of labor, we ask a what if questions. So what happens if we remove one unit of labor from the production process while holding other input constant? Output will typically fall from X to a lower level. So the marginalist idea is that the value of that unit of labor can be measured by the net loss of utility caused by the reduction in final output attributable to that missing unit. If losing one unit of labor causes a large reduction in output, especially output that consumers value highly, then the unit of labor has a high value. If the reduction in output is small, then its value is lower. So, however, the size of the reduction depends heavily on substitutability among inputs. So if labor can be replaced by more capital or machines or by different techniques, then removing one unit of labor may not reduce output much. Firms can adjust their input mix to compensate, but if labor is difficult to replace, output falls more sharply and the marginal value of labor is higher in that context. So this is why if you see in variable proportion, so the proportion, there are two productive relation here. If you see in variable proportion first, the proportion of higher order goods can be altered to produce a given output, at least within some range. A firm can substitute labor for machine or land for fertilizer and still produce similar output. So in this case, marginal productivity depends on the chosen combination, and the factor values reflect flexible adjustment at the margin. In fixed proportions, production requires a strict receipt. A fixed amount of one resource must be combined with a fixed amount of another to produce output. Think of a process that needs exactly one machine operator per machine. If an operator is missing, the machine cannot run, and output drops sharply. Under fixed proportions, substitutability is limited. So marginal loss from removing a unit can be large and discontinuous. So from this, we can see that factor valuation in marginalist theory depends not only on demand for the final product, but also on the technical structure of production and the degree of which inputs can substitute for one another. So how marginalists can evaluate the value of a unit of labor by asking what happens to output? If you see here, the evaluation of the value of unit of labor, there are based on the explanation from the previous slide. So under variable proportion, the production process is flexible actually. So a firm can adjust the mix of inputs when labor falls slightly. Suppose the initial amount of labor is A, and together with other inputs, it produces output X0. If labor is reduced by 1 unit, output does not collapse. It falls to X1. So the value of that unit of labor is then linked to the utility differences between producing X0 and producing X1. In simple terms, labor is worth that what society loses when output is reduced from X0 to X1. So this is X0 minus X1, meaning that the marginal product of labor measured in unit of output translated into utility terms. So when production is flexible, the marginal loss is usually small and continuous because the firm can substitute some capital or recognize tasks to soften the impact. Under fixed proportions, the production process requires a strict combination of inputs. Think of a case where output X can only be produced if a minimum amount of labor is present. If labor falls below that requirement, the process cannot operate at all. In this situation, reducing labor by 1 unit may mean no X is produced. The output drop is discontinuous. It is not a small change from X0 to X1, but a collapse from X0 to 0. And however, the firm may not be completely idle. The remaining resources, capital and land, for instance, could be reallocated to produce a different good, which is Y. So, but Y provides lower utility than X. This matters because the economic loss is not necessarily the loss of all production, but the loss of producing the best valued output. Okay. The value of goods used in production or factor of production such as labor, land, and capital good should be determined by the prospective value of the consumer goods they have produced. So this is what we call a forward-looking concept of value. Inputs are not valued mainly because the history behind them. They are valued because they are means to produce output that consumers will want in the future. If consumers are willing to pay, as we discussed before, a high price for the final products, firm will bid more aggressively for the inputs needed to produce it. And if demand is weak and expected product prices are low, the same input will have lower value in that use. Okay, I think this already explained as well before in the general theory of marginalists. Okay, continue to the second economist here, which is W.S. Jeffons, William Stanley Jeffons. Okay, general question for Manger? Okay, no ya. Okay, William Stanley Jeffons was a British economist and logician who became one of the key founders of marginal utility theory. So he was born in Liverpool into a merchant family, an environment that exposed prices and business cycles. So this background helped shape his later interest in applying careful measurement and scientific reasoning to economic problems. So Jeffons began his undergraduate studies at University College London, where he focused on chemistry and metallurgy. So his scientific training method, because it gave him a strong habit of precise observation and a belief that social phenomena could be studied with a method similar to those used in natural sciences. In 1854, he left school before completing his degree to take a position as an assayer at the Sydney Mint in Australia. As an assayer, he worked with metals and standard of measurement experiences that reinforce his attention to quantification and the practical role of money and precious metals in an economy. While in Australia, Jeffons didn't limit himself to technical work. He pursued private research in a wide range of topics, including meteorology, railroads, economics, and national statistics. So this period sharpened his interest in how economic systems behave over time and how data can be used to understand large-scale patterns, such as fluctuation in trade and industrial production. In 1859, Jeffons returned to London to complete his university education and to deepen his engagement with economics and logic. So his intellectual development culminated in his major economic contribution, particularly his work on marginal utility and the theory of value, which was published in early 1870s and helped launch the marginalist revolution. Jeffons' academic career advanced quickly. In 1966, he became a professor of political economy at Owens College. Owens College, later the University of Manchester, actually here. And in 1876, he returned to University College London as professor as well. So across these positions, Jeffons combined rigorous analysis with empirical interest, arguing that economics should be both theoretical, coherent, and informed by careful statistical observations. Jeffons' theory of political economy begins with a direct challenge to the dominant classical economics associated with Ricardo, John Stuart Mills. From here, Jeffons believed that classical theory had become too dependent on production-centered explanation and on broad class-based categories, while paying insufficient attention to the role of individual choice and demand. So for him, the central weakness was that classical economists tried to explain value mainly through objective factors such as labor time or cost of production, even though market price clearly respond to changes in wants, taste, and scarcity. So a key target of Jeffons' critique was the labor theory of value. So Jeffon argued that labor time cannot be ultimate explanation of price because it treats value as if it comes from the past, how much effort was expended, rather than from the represent or present and future, where consumer decide what goods are worth to them. If demand shift, the market price can change even when the labor time embedded in the good is unchanged. This suggests that utility and preferences must play a central role in price determination. So Jeffons, therefore, instead that value depends entirely upon utility, meaning that the willingness of consumer to pay based on the satisfaction they expected, it is fundamental. So he also criticized the wage fund doctrine, which claimed that there is a fixed stock of capital available for paying wages, and that average wages are determined by dividing this fund by the number of workers. So Jeffons saw this too rigid and unrealistic. Wages, he argued that vary with economic conditions, productivity, and demand for labor. A fixed fund cannot capture the way firms adjust employment output and investment as market changes. Methodologically, Jeffon was an advocate of mathematical economics, especially the use of calculus. So he believed economics should analyze small changes at the margin, how satisfaction changes with one more unit consumed, or how output changes with one more unit of input. So calculus, in his view, was the right tool to express the marginal relationship precisely and to derive clear condition for equilibrium. If you see here, Jeffons' critique is that labor time or a fixed wage fund cannot fully explain prices and incomes when demand, utility, and preferences changes. So by bringing utility, marginal analysis, and mathematical methods to the center, he aimed to rebuild value theory on a more general foundation that could explain both consumer behavior and market outcomes. Skip this one. Okay. Okay, this one. Okay, if you see this chart, this is Jeffons' core idea of diminishing marginal utility. The vertical axis measures marginal utility, MU, while the horizontal axis measures the quantity of a good consumed. So the curve slope downward, showing that as a person consumes more unit, the additional satisfaction from the next unit eventually becomes smaller. So this reflects common experience, which is the first unit often satisfies an urgent need, but later units satisfy less urgent wants. If you see here, the label X accent and MU accent identify one particular point on the curve here, yeah. So here, X accent is a chosen quantity of the good, and MU accent is the marginal utility at the quantity. So Jevons called this marginal utility of the last unit consumed the final degree of the utility. So the idea is important here because consumers make decisions at the margin when deciding whether to consume one more unit. What matter is not how useful the good is in general, but how much extra satisfaction that additional unit will provide compared with what must be given to obtain it, money, time, or another good. Okay, I think it's already explained in the class last week as well, yeah. Okay. It is already explained as well regarding water diamond paradox. Water is essential for life, but cheap. Yeah, it's done. Okay. So what about Jevons overall logic for linking productions and exchange value while keeping his central claim in view in here? So from Jevons' perspective, value depends entirely on utility. So Jevons developed his theory of exchange by starting with simplifying assumptions. So in the exchange moment, supplies are given. So that is, the quantities of goods available in the market are treated as fixed for the purpose of analyzing how prices are determined. So this allows him to focus on demand, marginal utility, and the condition under which exchange occurs. So however, Jevons didn't deny that supply must be explained as well. So he simply treated supply as determined by different set of forces, mainly on the production side. So what determines supply? Jevons explained that cost of production determines supplies, especially in the longer run. If producing a good becomes more expensive, fewer units will be supplied at any given market prices. If production becomes cheaper due to better technology or easier access to inputs, more units will be supplied. In this way, cost influence the availability quantity that reaches the market. Once supply is given in the exchange analysis, it interacts with demand to determine how much of the goods its buyer can obtain. Jevons also explained that supply determines the final degree of utility. The final degree of utility is marginal utility, which is the utility of the last unit consumed. If supply is abundant, consumer can obtain more units, and the last unit is likely used for less urgent purposes. So marginal utility is low. But if supply is scarce, consumer obtain fewer units, and the last unit is used for more urgent purposes, so marginal utility is high. And also, Jevons claims that the final degree of utility determines value. So market value expressed as prices reflects the marginality of the last unit exchange under condition of scarcity. So this does not mean costs are relevant. Costs matter because they shape supply, and supply shapes marginal utility. But the immediate determinant of value is utility at the margin. So the full chain from his talk is cost of production, supply, final degree of utility, and the value. Jevons' way of reconciling production and utility without returning to a cost-based theory of value. So cost influence value indirectly by affecting supply, but value itself is anchored is consumer utility and the marginal evaluation of scarce goods. Okay, there any questions? Yeah, I think enough for today. We finish talking about marginalis, and next week we talk about neoclassical, and also I think one more. Hold on, I check. There are 2 lectures for next week, and also there is individual quiz for next week. Where is it? Second update. Yeah, for next week, we will discuss about neoclassical and also institutionalism. So there are 2 lectures for next week, and there is individual quiz. So please come next week, of course, online, because I need another mark from you as individual. Okay, if there is no questions, I think this is enough. Thank you very much today, and have a nice day. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Doctor.
Doctor.
Thank you,
Thank you, Doctor.
Doctor.
Thanks, Doctor.
Thank you.